Good. I think let's kick off. So welcome everybody, and thank you for joining our training on location-focused decision-making, applying spatial datasets and metrics to assess locations and tailor nature strategies. This session is a part of the Embed Nature Capacity Building pilot program for business, which is a part of the HRAC project. And I'll come back to that shortly. My name is Amanda Griniece from World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and I'll guide you through the introductory part of the session. But after that, I will gladly hand over to the experts of this topic and the masterminds behind today's session, and also the handbook of which you will hear about later, Jacob Bedford and Amy Rankin from UNIP WCMC. And today we're also supported by some other project partners who will guide you through the group exercise. Karina Meruta and Nadine McCormick from WBCSD, Louise Aman from Capitals Coalition, and Jonathan Porter from OPLA. A really wonderful team all here for you today. So we have introduced ourselves, and now I would really like to invite you. First of all, please update your participant name with your organization. And also please introduce yourself in the chat so we can get to know each other a little bit better over these almost 2 hours. And while you do so, just a few housekeeping points. So we are recording this session and we'll share the snippets of the key parts of the session and also a summary with you afterwards. We have also designed some engagement opportunities. So for you to get most of this session, we encourage you to close down all other applications and participate actively throughout some discussions, breakout groups, and also ask your questions during the Q&As. A quick antitrust compliance reminder. So please do not bring up and discuss any of these type of sensitive topics today. And as I mentioned at the start, this session is part of the broader EU Horizon HRAC project, which stands for Accelerating Transformation Through Capital's Knowledge. It is a 4-year project with 11 project partners across Europe. You can see their logos on the screen. And the aim of this project is consolidate and mainstream existing tools and approaches so that a critical mass of businesses, financial institutions, and governments integrate nature considerations into the decision-making in order to accelerate action for nature positive outcomes. But the Embed Nature program is kind of a business-facing branch of this work, and our aim here is to support integration of nature in typical decision-making contexts, namely location-focused decision-making and nature in product and service design, which is more around the operational decisions. Also putting nature on the balance sheet, which is more linked to financial decisions, and nature-aligned business models more into the strategic decision area. And today we'll focus, of course, on the location-focused decision-making. And more specifically, today we are here to discuss the importance of the local context in designing and implementing effective nature strategies. Also to learn how to use spatial data to build narratives around dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities at priority locations, and explore how to choose and derive insights from spatial data through practical examples and open discussions. So, really exciting. This is how our agenda looks like. We're nearly done with welcome introductions, and then we'll move more into the content part. We'll start with location focus in nature strategies. Then we'll move towards spatial data and metrics and what to consider. Then we'll have a pause with some quiz. So please pay attention. And also there will be time for some discussion and Q&A. After that, we'll look into a case study on applying the mitigation hierarchy. And a really exciting part of today is a practical group exercise towards the end around using spatial data to inform your strategy. And after that, we will summarize and close. Good. So before jumping into the context, I would just like to quickly flag that all HRAC resources are freely available to use and share. So let us know if you find them useful in some context and if you apply them. And also, so far we have produced a bundle of resources for location-focused decision-making, but similar bundles will be developed for all other decision-making contexts, which I mentioned to you briefly. So for location, we have 3 practical business cases, a business primer for functional teams, what nature means for your business role, and a handbook, Building Narratives Through Nature Data, which is especially important as this session is built on this practical handbook, which you can explore after if you haven't already. I will share the link to these resources in the chat so you can explore further. And lastly, while going through this call, there will be time and space to ask questions, of course, but if there are any additional questions that you still have around the location-focused decision-making topic, please submit them via this form that we have shared, and we will try to gather answers for them for our troubleshooting session that's happening on the 9th of September, where you will also be invited to join. So that's it from my side. Before I hand over to to go into more content, let's just quickly have a look who is here today, and if you've been active in the chat, introducing yourself. So wonderful. I see lots of activity. Thank you, Larissa. Nice to meet you. Joining from Germany. Gemma from Opla. Wonderful. We have also Anise from KPMG, Switzerland. Wonderful. Good to meet you. Ariel from a Sustainability Innovation Analyst. Okay, wonderful. Lots of people joining. Thank you. So please keep introducing yourself, and we can come back to that a little bit later. Really wonderful to see lots of you here today. Good. I'll hand over now to Jacob to guide you through the content.
Hi everyone, yeah, thanks for joining. Nice to see so many different faces on the call. Today's session is all about kind of the use of data and information in tailoring nature strategy. So the first place to start is to recap why is it important to consider location when we're thinking about a nature strategy. So what we mean by location-specific decision-making is if we think of all the different levers that we can pull as an organization around nature, and the location-specific ones are the ones that are really about the actions that you take in specific places, kind of on the ground. And these actions and what's needed in different places will be different in different places, depending on the nature that's there, is their kind of basic summary. So we know that many nature-related risks and opportunities are location-specific, and they require this tailored action. And it's really important when we're thinking about a nature strategy to understand the local ecological conditions and to help kind of prioritize areas, prioritize actions, and allocate resources effectively. And so in summary, for a nature strategy to be really robust and effective, it must be location focused and be built on an understanding of the occurrence, the state and trends in nature at different locations. And this is where some quite simple spatial data sets and metrics can really help move this forward. And as we kind of probably all know on this call, this focus on location now is really embedded in many of the leading assessment and disclosure frameworks. So for example, the L in the LEAP approach of TNFD is locate. It's right at front and center. So TNFD recommends that organizations assess nature-related issues based on the geographic location of their operations. ESRS E4, which I know is going through a lot of changes at the moment, but still kind of fundamentally requires companies to list locations, biomes, and the biodiversity importance of where they operate. And the science-based targets methodology for nature acknowledges that impacts on nature are location-specific, and spatial information is really needed for companies to set effective science-based targets. So it's really underpinning everything that's happening in the nature space at the moment. But when we start thinking about, okay, how can spatial data sets and spatial metrics support in this process, it's important to think about what kind of step in the process are we at, and what kind of information are we really wanting from a data set or metric to help us support. And in our handbook, we kind of summarize 5 different roles that spatial data and spatial metrics can play in forming a nature strategy. So in this initial steps of just identifying the locations of operations, spatial data sets and metrics might support identifying locations. That might help with kind of delineating broader sourcing regions or landscapes, even just identifying the basic biomes and ecoregions that you might be operating in. You might start thinking about a high-level screening process of those areas or those parts of the value chain. And so spatial data sets might help with things like identifying designated and recognized areas. So are we operating near protected areas, for example? At a high level, what's the kind of general biodiversity significance of that area compared to others? Is it an intact area, or is it already quite degraded, and is it already threatened? So these kind of high-level screening questions. For many organizations that have, for example, complex operations, complex value chains, this high-level screening process might help with prioritizing as well. So we might take some of that information and start thinking, okay, which of our sites are the most urgent for avoidance and mitigation action, or which of our locations have the most opportunities for positive action, or what have the highest kind of operational risk exposure. And once we've got those kind of priority areas in our value chains, we might then think of doing some kind of more in-depth assessment. So we might use then more in-depth metrics to think about what are the specific ecosystem types or species present at these locations, what are the main threats and pressures at that specific location, and what are their dynamics. What's the kind of baseline condition of the specific ecosystems and the overall landscape? What are the kind of ecosystem services that are being provided in that area, and are they the ones we depend on? So already we can start to think that maybe some of the data sets that we need for characterizing, we don't necessarily need for a high-level screening process. But equally, some of the data that might be suitable for a high-level screening process might not be providing the level of detail that we need when we're really wanting to get into the nitty-gritty of a specific location. Then all of this information can support setting targets and setting actions, and we'll be kind of touching on that a little bit later. But spatial data sets and metrics can also help them with the kind of monitoring outcomes. So once we've put in our actions, we can then start thinking about monitoring. So this is where we start thinking about what are the changes in pressures and threats over time, what are the changes in species and ecosystems, and what are the changes in ecosystem service flows. And the challenge with monitoring is where we start needing that change over time. We start needing kind of data sets that might come into a time series, for example, and we might start needing data sets that are really specifically sensitive to the actions that we're taking. So we want to know, if I take an action, our planned action at that location, will it kind of show up in the data set, or will it be missed? And this means that when we're thinking about monitoring, we need quite specific characteristics for a data set to be able to use in that kind of monitoring phase that aren't necessarily needed in that kind of initial screening and characterizing phase, which can kind of take into account more static data sets. So we're starting to think now about what do we need spatial data sets and information for within a nature strategy. So what we'd love at this point is just to reflect on your own context as an organization, or an example of an organization you've worked with, and either in the chat, or we would love it if some people kind of volunteer to voice out loud. Do you have an example off the top of your head of how location context has influenced, or it could influence, your decision making around nature? So I know that bit spring on you there, so I'll give a couple of seconds to reflect, but if anyone would like to share. See hands.
I'm happy to share. It's Maeve from Schneider.
Fantastic, thank you.
If you want, I've just come off mute. Is that okay? Is that what you want me
Yeah,
to
perfect. Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Yeah.
A couple of ways we've been thinking about and now transitioning and starting to think about it in a different way. So one is that for the past 5 years, we've asked each of our about 270 sites to deploy biodiversity action plans, and those have got to take into account the local ecological risks. So as part of kind of the plan of working out what they should do, they've got to do some research and really understand what are the key priorities locally through local biodiversity action plans, or engaging with NGOs, that kind of thing. But increasingly, we're trying to tie it to a climate adaptation agenda. And so really trying to look at, well, what are the local climate risks? How do they affect the business? And what can we really do to tackle those, so very location specific.
Fantastic. Yeah, perfect. Fantastic example. Thank you. Really helpful. Just a couple more in case there's one in the chat. So some great examples coming in the chat, so I'll just read these out. So first is that often partners, so we have expressed that specific interest in ecosystem service valuation with a specific focus, because this can really help policy formation or investment strategies. And another great example was kind of mining companies which have high water dependency. So the location of a mine is really critical in terms of water resources. Perfect. So they're really fantastic examples. Thanks for those. Okay. Please do keep adding examples in the chat as I go. They're all really helpful. Okay. So when we start thinking then about finding or using spatial data and metrics, it can be quite overwhelming, as there's a lot of different data sets and metrics out there and a lot of different guidance and information. So in our handbook, and today we're really trying to just distill down to some really key elements in terms of key considerations. So this is our kind of very, very brief spatial data 101. So we have, when we're thinking about spatial data, we think of different types of data. So we have primary data. So this is data that's collected directly in the field by you or a third party. And data is often kind of relatively raw. So it requires further processing, transformation, and analysis before it's like useful. What's more commonly used is secondary data. So this is data that's sourced from external data providers. It's usually pre-processed, and the use case may be different from your own. And a really key concept to think of is this idea of transformation. So transformed data is data that has been kind of pre-processed and modified to be more useful for analysis, sharing, and decision-making. And it's likely that the tools and the data sets that you'll come across to help with nature strategies will already be highly transformed. So even a land use map, for example, that's been derived from remote sensing, that's already had a lot of analysis and a lot of processing happen to it before it becomes a map. And especially if we're thinking of a spatial metric, often there is lots of different information that's kind of brought together to produce this metric. So it's often useful to think, how transformed is this data set that I'm using, and where could sources of uncertainty come in that transformation process? Again, very basic kind of recap is that spatial data comes in different forms. So we have point data. So this is just geographic coordinates marking specific locations. So this, for example, might be species sightings or species records. Polygon data, these are shapes. So these define areas using a series of points. So an example of this might be protected areas or key biodiversity areas. And then raster data. So these are continuous layers where each pixel holds a value. So these are kind of akin to kind of a photo. So a good example of those is like an elevation map where each pixel will have a value, and that value is the height of terrain. So when you color that raster layer, you get a map of, you can see hills and you see a map of terrain. So that's kind of three basic forms of spatial data. But again, what's really important to think through is the attributes that a data set will have. So this is the table that provide the underlying information within a data set. So this is things like species present, the site names, or conservation criteria. And so it's really useful to think about what is the actual attributes that the data set holds, and is that information useful for me? And another important element is the metadata. So this is data. This is the data that describes the data set. So this provides the context about spatial data sets, which will help you understand and correctly apply them. So things like the format, the coordinate system, resolution, and source. And there's increasingly a lot of standards out there about metadata. So hopefully the quality and consistency of metadata is increasing all the time. But when you're thinking about applying these data sets for your own applications, you don't necessarily need to understand all of the technical elements behind it and all of the kind of really technical details. But it is useful just to think of some high-level considerations when you're approaching them. Firstly, just trustworthiness. So is the data from a credible source? Is it licensed for your use? So some data sets have commercial restrictions. I think the most important one simply is the relevance. What is it actually showing, and does it reflect the components of nature that I need to understand? Accuracy, is it based on observations, or is it just estimates and models? And that can give an indication of how accurate it's likely to be. Is there information about, has it been ground truth? So have any of the values been checked on the ground? And accuracy is a really interesting one because nature is very complex to measure. There are lots of nature data gaps in the world. And so accuracy is always there's always going to be an element of low accuracy in a lot of nature data sets, but it's important to think about what our application is, and is it accurate enough for the application we need. So for example, if I'm just trying to do high level screening of which areas are more important than the other, maybe, as long as it gives a general indication, maybe that's enough. But if I'm giving really detailed assessment on the ground that I want to report to key stakeholders, maybe I need more accurate data. Coverage and resolution. So this is just, does it cover the right area that I need? And does it offer sufficient kind of spatial detail? So is it only offering a value over 10 kilometers and my site is 1 kilometer? So it might not be detailed enough. And this is what we mentioned earlier about monitoring, is the kind of responsiveness and sensitivity. So can it show changes over time, and will it respond to the actions that I'm wanting it to? And this is, I think, one of our important take-homes, is that there are no single data set is available to sufficiently capture all of nature's complexity in one value. Trade-offs are always going to exist between coverage, resolution, accuracy, and responsiveness. So I think it's important that we move away from thinking which one data set should I use or which is better than the other, and think about how can we bring complementary metrics together to build a kind of multi-dimensional context-rich narrative. So just as a basic example, maybe I use one data set on ecosystem integrity, but that doesn't tell me anything about the threatened species. So I might need to complement those two data sets together to start to build a better picture of what's going on. So I'm aware that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of those elements of our handbook, a little bit of a data 101. But we do have a little quiz in the poll, just some basic questions, just to check understanding and highlight any issues. So we'll spend a couple of minutes now, if you could have a go at answering these questions, and then we'll go through the answers in a few minutes. Okay. Yes, and I appreciate, tricky questions, because they're not always, there's not always a clear right answer when we're thinking of data sets and metrics. There's always these trade-offs, as we mentioned. So this is kind of what we went for the answers. So the first one was, which of the following data sets shows the least amount of transformation? So an integrity index showing ecosystem condition across the region, a geo-reference land cover classification map based on satellite imagery, a restoration potential score for degraded landscapes, or an aggregated biodiversity intactness score for each ecoregion. So in terms of least amount of transformation, we went for B, a geo-reference land cover classification map. So as we said, there is likely to be some kind of data cleaning and some element that's gone from remote sensing data to a land cover map. But the other options were really quite highly transformed indices that take into account lots of different information. So ecosystem condition, for example, is likely going to take lots of different information, aggregate it together, transform it, rescale in order to get an index, and then that index is presented as a map. Similarly, a restoration potential score is likely going to take lots of different information, lots of different rescaling to get an aggregated score, so quite far from kind of raw data. And then D, similarly, kind of an aggregated biodiversity intactness score for each ecoregion is kind of, I suppose, taking option A and then averaging it over quite a large area in the ecoregion. Okay, the next one was to use a publicly available land cover classification dataset derived from satellite imagery by a government agency. This is an example of secondary spatial data. So it's likely that it's being kind of collected or produced by a different, not yourself, it's a government agency, and it's likely that that was done with not necessarily your specific use case in mind, but you're kind of reusing that data in your own context, rather than collecting it yourself. And lastly, the question was, you're working with a spatial data set of wetland locations, which includes fields like wetland type, condition, and area in square meters. Which of the following would be considered metadata rather than part of the dataset's attributes or content? And that is the source organization, coordinate reference system, and data resolution. So this, as we mentioned earlier, metadata is that data that describes a data set, so things like the coordinate reference system it's in and the data resolution, rather than attribute data, which is the actual information the data set contains, which is the values of that, the kind of values around nature that are in the data set itself. It's fine, no worries. So hopefully this has helped like get some basic concepts which will help ease the navigation of data sets when you're using them yourself. Okay, we're now going to go into thinking about how we take this understanding of the kind of attributes that a data might have and the that kind of information you might find in metadata about the kind of the licensing and the kind of information behind how the data set was produced, and how that might inform trade-offs on understanding which data sets you might use and in which context. So I'll just quickly go over the two questions, but then we'll go over them in more detail in a short breakout room. So the first example is that you're working in the development team of a renewable energy company. They want you to map land cover across sub-Saharan Africa to identify areas suitable for new solar energy installations. And you're considering the following 3 land cover data sets. Which one might you choose and what are your reasons? So there's not necessarily a right answer here, but we're just interested to start thinking through, based on this information and these trade-offs, which one might you choose and what are your reasons? And then the second one is that you work in a paper mill company that sources wood from South America and are researching your sector's impact on deforestation. We have 2 options here for data sets you might apply. And what are the relative strengths and limitations for each data set, and how might they influence the level of decision making you apply them for? So I won't go through all the details of each data set. These are hypothetical, by the way, lots of them. And we will reconvene after the breakout rooms. So Amanda, are you able to?
Yes. So you should be automatically directed to your breakout room.
B would be most kind of robust one scientifically, so maybe there's options to kind of think about, is there any way of speaking to them about whether we can think about our use case? But it shows that these trade-offs happen, right? So often things like licensing and scientific robustness are trade-offs to think about when we're scoping available data sets. Great. So we have a couple of minutes now where we're just going to take a quick break from the screen if you want. So if you wanted to reflect on this a little bit more, or ask any questions, or if you want to just take, let's see, maybe a 5-minute break, go grab a glass of water, and I think that now's the option before we move on to the next section, where we'll be starting to think through some fictional case studies of the whole process of using data to think about a strategy. So the HVAC team, I think, will stay on if there's any questions, but if not, we'll reconvene at 10 to the hour, if that's okay. I'm going to now hand over to my colleague Amy for the next section. Thanks.
Thanks, Jake. Okay, so for this section, we're going to go through a couple of hypothetical case studies. And for each scenario, I'm going to walk you through how different types of spatial data come together and what kind of results they give us. And from there, we'll see what kind of insights can guide the way that we design our strategies. So Before we dive into the first case study, I think it's helpful to pause and ground ourselves a bit in the mitigation hierarchy. And this is the best practice framework that's widely used to manage biodiversity impacts at project sites. So some of you might already recognize it, but I can quickly walk through the different stages together. It's built around 4 steps, which you can see in this diagram. They are avoid, minimize, restore, and offset. And the key point is that the first 2 steps, avoid and then minimize, should always come first. The goal is to reduce impacts as much as possible upfront before thinking about any restoration or offsetting actions. So what does this look like in practice? So avoid means taking preventative action before impacts even occur. For example, you could carefully screen out sites to rule out sensitive areas, or you could schedule work to avoid sensitive times of years for animals, such as their breeding or nesting seasons. And this is often the most effective and cost-efficient way to reduce impacts. And then minimization is about reducing the intensity, duration, or the scope of impacts that can't be completely avoided. And this might include design choices like using quieter machinery or operational controls like limiting vehicle speed to minimize collisions with wildlife. But after avoidance and minimization, if you still have residual impacts, then the restore step has to come in. This is where you actively repair ecosystems that you have damaged, whether that's reestablishing habitats or species or even ecological functions. So, for example, if your operations have resulted in the introduction of an invasive species, to restore the ecosystem, you would go through a program of removing invasive plants, for example, and reintroducing native ones. And then the final step there is offset. And this is only considered once all the previous steps have been taken. Offsets involve compensating for any remaining impacts by taking action in other areas, such as restoring habitats in the surrounding landscape. And this step is often very costly and the results are not guaranteed, so it should be your last resort. So when done rigorously, this sequence of these 4 steps can help you address your impacts on nature. And when your impacts are completely balanced by your mitigation actions, then the overall biodiversity level at your site should be the same as it was before you started work. And this is what we call a no net loss of biodiversity. Then, if you go further and you're able to show that through your restoration assets and offsetting that nature is in a measurably better state than when you started, this is what we call a net gain of biodiversity, or you might also hear the term net positive impact. So when all of your impacts have been mitigated to deliver either a no net loss or even a net gain for biodiversity, there's also a chance here for you to look further for opportunities through additional conservation actions. And these are actions that further the benefit of nature, even if they're not directly tied to a project's impacts. And because of this, they can be quite broad in scope, such as supporting species programs, maybe community-led conservation projects, or you might have schemes for knowledge sharing and capacity building, for example. And so that's really just to set the scene with the mitigation hierarchy. Now let's move into a case study example to show it in action. So here we've got a hypothetical multinational mining company, and we're going to imagine that it's rolling out a new sustainability strategy. And as part of that, they're developing biodiversity action plans for each of their priority sites. And their aim is to reduce negative impacts while improving biodiversity value, both at the site and across the wider landscape. And so one of their priority sites they've identified is a mine in Chile. It's represented by the white area in the middle of the map on the top left-hand side of your screen. And it's got 2 white dotted lines circling it. So the first white dotted line circle shows a 10-kilometer buffer around their mining sites, and then the second one shows a 50-kilometer buffer around their mining sites. And so let's imagine this company have done some initial research, and they found that it's in an ecologically sensitive area. It's dominated by dry heath and shrubland with some seasonal streams. They've got croplands surrounding their mine, and there's nearby urban settlements as well. And because of this context, the company wants to use spatial datasets and global biodiversity metrics to build a clearer picture of what's there and what risks their activities might pose. And so you can see two of the global resources they've used in this map on the top left-hand side of the screen. In the green, they've looked at the World Database of Protected Areas. And this dataset reflects boundaries of areas that have legal protections. And in the red, they've shown the Key Biodiversity Areas dataset. And this reflects boundaries of areas that are recognized for their scientific significance for biodiversity. So already we can see from this spatial data that there's a protected area within 10 kilometers of their mining site. And there's also 2 key biodiversity areas within 50 kilometers of the mining site. I haven't shown it on the screen here, but what you can do is you can get some more detailed information from the assessment documentation for these biodiversity areas. And if you look in there, the company would see that some of these areas are home to a particularly sensitive and endangered species of cactus that isn't found anywhere else, for example. They've also looked at 3 types of metric, which you can see on the maps on the bottom right-hand side of the slide. And the first of these shows the species threat abatement and restoration metric, which we abbreviate to STAR. So what this dataset does is it shows you the importance of reducing threats in any given area for the global persistence of a species. So the higher numbers, which are in dark blue, show areas where the benefits of reducing threats are more significant. And in this case, in this fictional scenario, the STAR metric shows particularly high values just to the south of the mining sites. And then the company could look into that a bit more and find out, for example, that this area is important for species like the endangered Andean cat. The map in the middle shows critical natural assets. These reflect the importance of an area for providing local and global ecosystem services. And in this case, the higher numbers are in dark green, and these show areas which are more significant. So in this case, the area southeast of the site has higher values, indicating that the natural functioning of this area is important for the local population. And then finally, for the map on the right, this orange map, it shows Ecosystem Integrity Index. So this index reflects the estimated level of degradation compared to a natural reference. So the higher values in bright orange mean there's higher integrity. And the yellow patches show areas of low integrity. So we can see here that areas of degradation exist to the northeast of the site, for example. And yeah, just to iterate what we've put in the chat, the references and links for the details of this case study can be found in the handbook with the link below there. And you can learn up about more of these data sets as well. So based on these findings, we can imagine the company started to design a mitigation strategy following the mitigation hierarchy, which we looked at in the previous slide. So to avoid impacts in the first place is the most important step. So what they're going to do is they're going to carry out an impact assessment and create buffer zones around those protected areas to prevent expansion of activities into these spaces. They could also rethink their road infrastructure to reduce habitat fragmentation, particularly the area south of the sites, as this is where the ecosystem integrity is quite high and where the STAR scores indicate the greatest potential for reducing threats to species. To minimize remaining impacts, what they could do is they could work with local communities to manage water use and to protect ecosystem services that the people rely upon. That'd be particularly important southeast of the site, where the data identified multiple critical natural assets. Of course, there will still be some residual impacts that can't be avoided or minimized, so the company would plan to implement a restoration program to help repair the damage caused by their project. They could focus on the northeast. For example, they could plant wildlife corridors to reconnect patches of habitat between those adjacent protected areas, and that could help endangered species like the Andean cats move around a bit more easily. Then, despite these plans, the company might predict that some residual impacts would remain. That could be due to past destruction of vegetation under the mine's footprint. So to compensate for this, what they could do is design appropriate offsets, focusing on the key biodiversity areas. So I mentioned that there's that globally significant and geographically restricted cactus species. So what they could do is work with local conservation programs to carry out seed banking and conservation of that species. So the key takeaway here that I'm trying to get at is by combining global spatial data with on-the-ground context, it can help you make more informed decisions. And this will give you a much better understanding of biodiversity features and ecosystem services at risk, and help you design strategies that balance your operational needs with your conservation goals. And of course, the process, it doesn't stop here, because success depends on continuous monitoring, adapting as new data sets come in, and working closely with the local stakeholders as well. So we focused on direct operations there, like that mining site where you know exactly where the impacts are happening. But in many supply chains, it's not always possible to trace things back to the individual operation. And that lack of traceability, combined with the fact that companies often have less direct influence over what happens in the ground, can make it much harder to design effective nature strategies. However, spatial datasets metrics can still provide you with valuable insights in these cases. And instead, decisions in these contexts often need to be made at the landscape scale. So that means looking at broader sourcing regions, which can help shape sourcing strategies, guide your supplier engagements, and highlight opportunities for you to participate in collective initiatives with other companies in the landscape, other stakeholders operating in the landscape as well. So to bring this idea to life a bit, imagine you've got a fictional food and beverage company that's screening for nature-related issues in its cocoa supply chain. The company might not know the precise farm locations where their cocoa is coming from, but by using crop layers, they're able to identify the likely sourcing regions within 2 countries they buy from. So I've got here maps for Cameroon and for Ghana. And using these, they can start building a high-level risk profile, comparing the context and thinking about what kinds of tailored actions might make sense for these 2 different locations. So what they could do is apply the same kind of data sets that we saw in those first case studies. So looking at protected areas, key biodiversity areas, ecosystem integrity, and STAR, and use that to identify where biodiversity risks are concentrated. They might be spread evenly across the landscape, or they might be clustered into hotspots. And on top of that, they can also bring in forest loss data to profile land use change. And that would give them a sense of whether cocoa is being grown on land cleared a long time ago, or whether it's driving new deforestation. So here on the purple map on the left, I've got the biodiversity intactness index, with darker areas showing high integrity of the biodiversity present. And then next to that, there's a map to show forest loss by year, with yellow areas showing recent deforestation and blue areas showing deforestation that's happened further in the past. And by looking at that, what this company could find is that in Cameroon, much of the forest loss is quite recent, and the remaining ecosystems are relatively intact. That means that there's a higher risk that sourcing cocoa from here could be directly linked to new deforestation and loss of intact habitats. Whereas on Ghana, on the right-hand side, most of the deforestation happened further in the past. And so the overall integrity of ecosystems is already lower. And this suggests that cocoa is more likely to be coming from existing farmlands rather than driving brand new forest loss, for example. And so the key takeaway here from this case study is that even without precise farm locations, companies can use spatial data sets and metrics to screen for risks in their supply chains. And this can help you flag where more detailed assessments are needed. And it also points towards different types of strategy. So in this example, in Cameroon, the focus could be on avoiding new deforestation, whereas in Ghana, the emphasis could be on restoration and agroforestry to improve connectivity and resilience. And I've just seen in the chat, does the critical natural assets have a GIS layer associated with it? The answer is yes. We can maybe pop a link to that paper in the chat. And Jake's read my mind. He's already put it there. Fantastic. Okay. So what I'd like us to do now is go through an exercise together. So this will use a fictional scenario where you will need to discuss and interpret spatial data within a group. in order to make decisions and tailor your nature strategy. So the scenario I'm going to give you is you have been tasked with developing an action plan for your farming operations in a coastal region. You're going to have 3 locations in the landscape and going to present you with different types of spatial data. And your team has found that the landscape contains important biodiversity features, as well as some human settlements and other actors in the landscape. So using the spatial data, you'll have to, first of all, pick a priority operation to focus your initial actions within your plan. So just focusing strategy for one site. And then I'd like you to identify potential impacts from your farming location, and then suggest some potential mitigation actions and actions to explore next steps for developing your action plan. So here's what you know so far about your landscape, and don't worry about memorizing this map. We'll have it up on the screen when we break out into groups. You'll have 3 farming locations marked A, B, and C on the map. You'll see that there's a river running through the landscape, as well as some animal migration routes marked in yellow. North of the river, there are some roads. There's also a turtle nesting site. And to the south of the river, there are some villages where people live. There's a site of cultural significance. And then on the coast, there's some fishing grounds as well. So in this exercise, we will be using a Miro board to present you with different types of data to gather your ideas. And a link to the Miro board has been posted in the chat. If you haven't used Miro board before, it's kind of like an interactive whiteboard with post-it notes. You can draw on it, use the right click on your mouse to zoom around it to move around. But your facilitator will also have it up on the screen if you have any difficulties accessing it. So in the breakout groups, you're going to be interpreting different types of spatial data, and you're going to vote on which farm you think you should focus on and prioritize for your action plan. And then in the second part, you're going to identify potential impacts from your farm and come up with mitigation actions to address them. And then one person from each group will give a short report back to the wider group. And again, just to reiterate, there are no right or wrong answers in this exercise. It's more about just having interesting discussions with each other, sharing ideas about spatial data and your strategy. So I think now we can break out into our breakout groups and come back in around 30 minutes time. Hi everyone, welcome back. Well done on completing that exercise. I know that in my group we had some really interesting conversations and discussions, so I'm looking forward to seeing what everyone was talking about, whether we came up with the same kind of solutions, prioritized the same sites, and I think it will show really how the data can be interpreted so differently depending on the context. So who would like to report back first from their group? Jake?
Yeah, I think we had a volunteer. Thanks.
Oh, great.
Yes. Yes, so in our group, we noticed the difficulty firstly of deciding on the site, because there were lots of trade-offs present. We chose to prioritize site A because it's in between 2 protected areas. There's a deforested area to the northeast. It's in a migration pathway of animals, and there's potential for impacts of runoff into some of the waterways that are close by. So that was the reasons that we chose A. The impacts that we identified, as I said, so water impacts and soil pollution, so some runoff from pesticide and fertilizer use into the waterways, impacts on the migration trail itself, potential impacts if we expand the site, because there is, of course, these key protected areas on either side. So there's a risk of getting into that land. And then
yeah, we said also landscape fragmentation, because there are lots of different types of landscapes in and around site A. With regards to the mitigation hierarchy, we said that we would avoid human and wildlife conflict, we would avoid disturbing the animal migration route, as well as avoid fertilizer and pesticide runoff. So that's really the impact. We would minimize harmful pesticide use and minimize the use of ecotoxic chemicals, as well as harmful agricultural practices. On the restoration side, we agreed that we would develop ecological corridors to improve the ecosystem integrity of the area, because it's also kind of half-half in that ecosystem integrity between poor and high quality. And there's a potential to restore the previously logged forest into a restored forested area. So that is somewhere between restoration and offset. It's not super clear yet where that would be. And then on our next steps, so our next steps would be to engage with the local community on some of these impacts and mitigation measures, to understand the types of crops which are grown there, if they're water intensive, for example, if they require harsh use of chemicals. We would list the presence of different types of fauna and flora in that area. Check with the local laws in terms of what is allowed with regards to emissions. And we would involve procurement departments to source less harmful chemicals, for example. So yeah, I mentioned a few things, but we actually had a very hearty discussion on multiple different aspects. Yeah. If anybody else from my team would like to contribute, please go ahead.
No, that was great. Thank you for volunteering. Always brave.
Yeah, thank you so much. It sounded like you discussed so many different things and really considered it very carefully, your plan. So that was really great to hear. Jonathan, do you have a volunteer for your group?
I'm sorry, I didn't get a volunteer. If anybody would like to volunteer, they're very welcome to. Otherwise, I'm happy to do it if nobody wants. Okay. But please do fill in if I miss anything. We covered a lot as well. It was a great discussion, really good exercise. So thank you for dreaming it up for us. We went for C, I think, because we assumed we were expanding our farming operations. Perhaps we're a bit entrepreneurial. So we thought we'd sort of C looked like the one that was perhaps going to have the least impacts for us to work on. So we were sort of thinking avoid even from the start. And we thought obviously the main impacts that it could have are on the migratory routes, close to that. We don't know much about the grasslands. People naturally sort of drawn towards forests, but grasslands can be very beautiful and wonderful too. And there's obviously a cultural heritage site nearby, and the coastal communities as well were key. A key consideration. Obviously, there's a fishing industry there as well. So we need to think about those ecosystem services for local people. There are the villages nearby, and there are high levels of ecosystem service provision in that landscape. And obviously also out to sea as well, in those fisheries as well. So, it seems less sensitive, but there obviously are still many sensitivities. Mitigation hierarchy, we looked to think about the migration corridors, thinking about ecoducts and the things you see in the Netherlands for species to cross motorways, whatever. Consider ecoducts, but also think about the timing of migrations. Obviously, certain times of the year we might need to limit our operations to avoid effects on the migration. Obviously, the ecosystem services, thinking about on site, so we may be able to use the ecosystem services on site, so such as vegetation to avoid to absorb fine dust on the farming operation. There might be things that we can do already, or obviously thinking about those impacts on the grassland landscapes as well. What can we do there as part of it?
Excellent.
So, sorry, have I gone on too long?
Oh, no, I just want to make sure we've all got a little bit of time to report back. I think it's really interesting that you went
Sorry.
for picking C based on maybe expanding operations. I think that's a really cool lens. And actually in our group, we also decided to go for option C. We were thinking more along the lines of if we had like a regenerative agriculture business, that's probably what we would pick. And we actually discussed quite a lot of the same things. So that's quite
Cool.
That's quite cool to see here. Nadine, for your group, did you go for a different decision?
We went.
We were kind of running out of time, so
yeah,
maybe focus on what was different.
give you the headline. So it was A because we wanted to be near existing infrastructure and the road rather than creating infrastructure. And the landscape was relatively degraded already around. And so aside from avoiding and minimizing the negative impacts, so to make it worse, we also discussed quite a bit, the opportunity side as well. We didn't know what we were growing, but we thought, could we do some agroforestry? So we could maybe try to, expand some of the forestry cover. And then one of the key stakeholders to reach out to is who's actually owning the land that's been all deforested. We would want to reach out with them with the view and potentially having a more landscape level initiative down the line. So I think they're probably the complementary parts we would add.
Nice. And Louise, what about your group?
Yeah,
Yes.
that was me. I can keep it short there if you like. We actually had a bit of confusion between whether we were picking one of these sites to build a farm or whether all these farms existed, and we needed to pick between them based on a biodiversity action plan. So we had a conversation about whether we pick. We went with A if we were going to build a farm, and we went with C if we were going to prioritize a farm based on its sensitivity due to kind of the high ecosystem integrity, high biodiversity, and its proximity to some of those key areas as well. And in terms of the, we said a lot of similar things to everyone else, but just some extra ones. We spoke about kind of regenerative agricultural practices, water stewardship strategies, and engaging the local stakeholders, which include the villagers. We actually, one of us mentioned that it's actually quite a good job opportunity creation. So something positive to engage the community on, but also the wider stakeholders as well. So looking at kind of Indigenous peoples groups, any sort of stakeholders within the water catchment area, that sort of thing. And also internal buy-in was kind of the key for us in terms of next steps and engaging all the different departments.
Thanks, Molly. You actually did double the work because you were working up 2 scenarios, and yeah, I really like your ideas about job opportunities. That came up in our group as well. Thank you so much, everyone. It sounds like you all had great conversations in your group. Yeah, someone says chat, lots of different lenses to think about with this data and use cases. So thank you very, very much. Now going to move on to the next slide. Yes, for our summary and close. So on the next slide, we've just got on the screen some different tips that we have for applying spatial information to tailor strategies. So we've listed 10 different ones there that we think are some key recommendations. And would anyone like to share some tips with the group? You can pop them in the chat or stick up your hand. I think we've probably covered quite a few of them in our exercise as well, actually.
I've got one. Use free software, because even if you've got a paid software license, your stakeholders probably won't do. So by using free software, you can basically democratize the access to the spatial data.
I think the first tip needs to be you need to understand, I'm assuming this is related to a particular site, right? So you need to have your full strategy and purpose for that site, because everything is contextual. The site is contextual, the nature is, but also the context in which you plan to use your site.
Definitely, the context is super important. Thanks, Laurie. Thanks, John. I see Gemma put in the chat. Avoid data that is using AI to make analyses. Yeah, I mean, data AI can be your friend, but also you want to think about exactly how it's performed those analyses to verify that it makes sense. and it's doing what you expect it to do for sure. But keep posting those top tips in the chat as we come up with them. And I think I'll hand over to Amanda.
Thank you, Amy. And thank you so much, Jacob and Amy, for designing this really interesting session and also the handbook. And thanks to our amazing facilitators, Nadine, Karina, Jonathan, and Louise, for running the exercises. And most of all, thanks to all of you for this active participation. That was truly appreciated. And just to we would really appreciate if you could fill this really quick feedback poll that you see on your screens right now. And please rate from 1 to 10, 1 is the lowest and 10 is the highest. How relevant and valuable was this session for you? And how confident and motivated are you to take some action, to influence some change as a result of this training? And also there is a bit like a open-end question. How do you see yourself applying what you learned about spatial data? And what is the first step you could take after this session? And if you're not shy, we would also love to see this copied in the chat. So maybe someone else can get some inspiration from you as well. And if you have any other questions, there's also room to add them there. We'll leave it open while I'll just run through the closing slides. And again, you're very welcome to come back to our troubleshooting session on the 9th of October for CET to share a bit of your progress, discuss challenges, remaining questions. There is a place where you can add your additional questions, as we mentioned before. And we've also shared the link where you can register for the troubleshooting session. We really hope to see you there. And finally, besides the location sessions, we'll have similar bundle of sessions for putting nature on the balance sheet around the financial decision making later in October and November. And next year, our focus will be on topics nature in product and service design and nature positive aligned business models. You can also register your interest for these topic areas as well. We just shared the link in the chat. And lastly, you can explore more of these location-focused resources that we've referenced quite a bit during this call, the business primer, the handbook, which was very closely linked to today's session, and the practical case studies for some peer learning. And of course, your feedback is always welcome about our pilot sessions, about resources, etc. I think we're close to the top of the hour, so thank you very much again for your super active participation, and we really hope you learned something new. And yeah, thank you. We hope to see you in the next sessions. If you have any burning questions, we're going to still be here for a couple of minutes, so you're welcome to stay. Thank you.